All right, welcome in everybody. So happy to see you. Like I was saying a couple of minutes ago, if you don't mind sharing where you are joining us from today, that would be amazing. But I think we should go ahead and get started with our conversation today. So this is a new series for us at Axonic, although not a whole new thing for us because Marc and I actually talked several times before and broadcasted it through the podcast I was doing for Axonic just a few years ago. At the time, Marc hadn't joined our team, but I am super, super happy that he is part of Axonic now. And yeah, really glad to be able to talk to him a lot more often these days, which is great. But yeah, so we decided to have this super casual conversation with everybody where we just pick a topic and start a conversation and talk about the goods, bad, and maybe the ugly. Hopefully, there are no uglies, but we can talk about it all. And I would love to hear your perspective on the conversation as well. Our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat here. And at the end of the session, Marc and I will talk maybe 25 minutes or so, and then we'll open the discussion to everybody. So if you'd like to join us and bring in your questions or your comments, you can always raise your hand. We can have you unmute your microphone, or even if you'd like to show your wonderful face, we can have you come in through the video as well and just talk with us, because this is what it's all about. We just want to have a chat with you, our wonderful community, and yeah, see what your thoughts are on different topics. Before we start with our chat today, I just want to go into a couple of household items. So I am Sarah Torrey. As some of you might know me, I am the product manager here at Axonic, and I have our wonderful Marc Klefter with me. He is our senior solution architect, and he comes with a lot of experience, a lot of wonderful background to share with us today. And I also have our colleague Drew behind the scene, who is going to share some links of resources and materials with you. And also, if you have questions, he will be able to send those over and we can respond to those questions. So some helpful resources if you are interested to dig a little bit deeper into the conversation we're having today. We will be talking about various topics, mainly with starting a project if you are using event sourcing or possibly CQRS, DDD, whatever architectural choices that you're having. We'll talk about those, but we will focus quite a bit on event modeling, which is a really important part of starting a project, or maybe migrating from an older system into a newer system. So there are some really helpful resources here for you. And we will come back to these resources towards the end as well. And Drew can share those links in the chat if you'd like to check those out. A couple of upcoming events that Marc is doing this month and next month, actually. He is doing a CQRS event sourcing with durable execution with Axon and Restate. This is a really interesting topic, and I'm actually personally really interested, so I will be there to watch the webinar. Marc is presenting it with one of our partner, Restate, and that's happening on March 27th. And the other event that he is planning on doing is in April, and it's a multi-day event. It's going to be around designing and building event source applications. So part of the conversation we're having today is going into a lot more details with the audience during those days. So it's a training event. So if you're interested in that, we will share those as well. So you can go ahead to our events page and sign up for those events. So all done with the household things. Now let's get to the topic of the day. Where to begin when event sourcing, right? And Marc, you had this amazing quote that I borrowed. You were talking about how to employ first principles reasoning to discover the truth about a business domain with event modeling, and how that truth can be consistently managed with event sourcing. So quite a lot of information in this one sentence. Maybe talk about that a little bit. First of all, what do you mean by truth? What's this truth we're talking about?
Is there the truth or a truth? That's a really good question. And the quote is indeed a mouthful.
Yeah.
But I think first principles reasoning, the truth about a business domain, I think that's a good place to start before we sort of begin with event sourcing. because yeah, you want to start with event sourcing, an architectural pattern that we all love and enjoy. But the path towards building event source systems, I think, begins much earlier with a search for the truth.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a good place to start. Um, have you ever seen an episode of House MD?
Oh my gosh, many episodes, but it's been a lot of years.
Yeah. So, in every episode, they go back and forth, the
Mhm.
House and his team,
Yeah.
through all sorts of Q&As, mistakes, discoveries. Eventually, they arrive at the truth to heal the patient.
But before
Uh,
that, eventually the patient always almost dies.
always
And
us,
then they
yes.
recover, right?
Yeah, because House is reckless and super smart, and that combination often yields interesting
I'm
results.
glad you bring in this example because I feel like there are a lot of similarities that you can draw between, software development and an episode of House. Because we all love, as a software developer, you love to just get to the nitty-gritty of the code and start typing code down, right? And then
Yeah.
see what happens. But then I guess there's a few steps you have to take before
Yeah, so in
you warm up
House,
your fingers on the keyboard. Yeah.
yeah, so in house, everything starts with a patient and they get a file with some information, oftentimes too little information, but they need to start digging in somewhere to discover what the hell we're supposed to do now. What is ailing this patient? And they use the Socratic method. There's an episode of House titled The Socratic Method. Um, their version, I think, they call it differential diagnosis, but they use a tool of Q&A, basically. A group of peers with House being the quote unquote leader. We call it maybe more gently a facilitator
Right.
that through Q&A, through discovery, through back and forth, they interrogate their beliefs
Mhm.
about the patient, what they understand about it, about the case, and scrutinize themselves, each other, to try to get closer to the truth.
Mhm.
And the more you think about it, and you sort of alluded to it, that's pretty much where you start with your business domain, with some information in hand, a group of peers with different backgrounds, different specialties, and the process is very reminiscent of what you see in the show.
Yeah.
Now, we are also aided, if we choose to, by this great tool called event modeling, but it's a visual aid. It's something we can use to even further this process and make it more straightforward, more easy. But all in all, we start with a search for the truth about the business domain that we're
Mhm.
supposed to build an information system for.
So I want to go back to that a little bit because you did mention, when you are deciding what this truth is that we're trying to discover, right? Um, Even in the episode of House MD, we see that there are various colleagues from different backgrounds coming in together. I want to focus on that a little bit as well with our system designs, right? You did mention we need to have a group of people. I think that's really important when we're talking about a group of people. And a lot of times they are referred to as the stakeholders. Let's talk a little bit about the stakeholders. Who are these people that need to come together to find out what is this business truth, right? That we're trying to discover and then trying to design a whole system or a combination of various systems together. Who are these
Yeah.
people that we need to put in together in one room? And who is the leader then? Who's the facilitator?
So when it comes to the participants, it can be a very eclectic mix. Usually, you sort of, when you start thinking about the business domain, you realize that it has a number of capabilities.
Mm.
These capabilities come together to form business flows, so they participate in business flows. So you try to recruit the people that work in a capability within the business domain or several, if that's the responsibility, to get them into the room because their knowledge of how the organization works and what the workflows are is key. Um, but then you also need to bring, of course, the ones that will be building this particular information system who have often some or little knowledge of the peculiarities you might call it, of the domain. And this is, again, very reminiscent of the kind of specialties you need in a house team.
Yeah.
And this sort of is what you'll quickly discover is the requirement here as well, just to get a conversation started. Now, who is the facilitator? It's hard to pinpoint a specific role or character. Often this sort of yields itself almost, but it's of course someone that needs to understand event modeling to some extent and maybe has dabbled in it, but has a natural instinct for posing questions, gently guiding this peer group and trying to steer them and keep them on track, maintain focus. So yeah, should, maybe it's a harsh word to use, but it ought maybe to be a person that has this natural inclination to becoming a herder, so to speak, and keep the group on track. And it's often not a long search to find this person. Either this person just manifests him or herself, or someone will quickly get into that role. But yeah, it's the selection process there is no standard mechanism for it, as I have found.
Yeah, I think though it's important because many times when we talk about designing applications, we feel that, okay, all of the software architects and software engineers and maybe the CTO even, or maybe if we're generous, the head of product needs to be in there. But I think it goes beyond that. And I think that's worth mentioning that, the business side of the whatever business you are working with, they have to also be present, right? I think a lot of times it's important to bring somebody even from sales or customer care, because that's really important. Those are the people who are in direct contact with the users. And those are the folks who listen to the good and the bad and the ugly, right? Going back to from the users, and they have that insight to bring into the table to understand, okay, this truth that we're searching for, it has various angles to it. And I love the every software developer's favorite answer, which is it depends, right? The truth might look a little bit differently to the engineering team that it might to, let's say, the sales team or customer care or even solution architects, because you're looking at it from various angles. So having everybody coming into the room really provides a nice diversity of opinions, a nice selection of information that's been gathered from various parts, bringing it together onto the table and understanding it, and then going from there. And one of the favorite things of mine from the DDD book that I love and constantly go back to is the ubiquitous language. Because when you're designing a system, when you are in that first baby steps of deciding, okay, what goes into the system? Are we using a modularized system? Are we using a monolith? How are we going about it? Those are really important when you have a common language between various parties and various stakeholders. Because one of the things I always go back to from my days before software career was, if you're talking about a client, and I've had my own business several times, and in my younger years, when you're talking about a client, you're talking usually about a person or a company, right, that you are dealing with. It's that more of a one-to-one or one-to-many that you can use in software as well. But we're talking more in terms of human clients, right? But when you're coming to software, client means something very differently. So when you are bringing in these various people from various backgrounds, we also have to understand that somebody who is in the sales team, if they say client, they're most likely talking about their client that they're trying to sign a contract with. But if software engineers come in and say client, you're talking about the software system, right? So that is important to clarify and have that from the get-go as well. But yeah, please continue.
I mean, just I love the going ahead with the house comparison. Constantly in the show, you see a translation of terms of understanding that the doctors have with the patient, him or herself, relatives, other parties that can prove useful to getting to the truth about the the diagnosis, they need to share what they know using different terms, or rather come up with terms that everybody can sort of get along with. And
Absolutely.
that way, it surprises me sometimes how often we encounter this in real life, but we make it slightly more difficult in these kinds of circumstances. It's like unwilling to give up the terms we know or continue to use them where they maybe are not that appropriate. But I think with event modeling, it does help because we need to name our state transitions or events in a way that it does make sense. So
Yeah.
everybody
And
should
we
be able
all,
to, yeah, look at this event, look at this name. If there is any type of sort of misunderstanding or inability to get to wrap your head around what that means, maybe you haven't used the right, as you say, language to express your state transitions.
and as we all know, the hardest thing about software development is naming, right?
Yeah,
We can design
yeah.
beautiful systems, but when it comes to naming, there will be hours of heated discussion to figure
Yeah,
out what is the
yeah.
right name. That's great. All right, so once we found this truth, whatever that might be, then what?
So again, in-house, your patient log is constantly updated, right? You prescribe something, you change the medication, you perform procedures, checkups. This truth is also something we need to, of course, record and then manage long term. So we will go back to the truth. You need to make modifications. You learn new things. So this is not just one stop and then you're done, of course. But the practical means through which we record and manage this organizational truth is something you very aptly can do through event sourcing. So now you arrive at something concretely, I wouldn't say developed, but designed maybe. Whoever came up with event sourcing, but there is something now you can employ to be able to build a system using this fundamental source of truth, as we often call it. Yeah.
So a quick question on that one. So I really love that you mentioned that this is with event modeling, as things develop, change, evolve, maybe business requirements change as well. We have to constantly go back to this document, let's call it, which is our event modeling document. And in a sense, it is a very much a living document. So we have to constantly go back to it, revisit it, replenish it, change things, and we have to do this with the team involved as well, with the team of the stakeholders involved as well. So I think it's important to note this because many times, in my experience at least, folks get really excited about that first step. Yeah, let's get the sticky notes onto the wall or in the mirror, wherever you are working. And then they get everything figured out, they get the UI figured out and everything, and then everybody goes to work. A year later, we come back together to see this, quote unquote, finished product. And then we realize, wait a second, we didn't sync in prior. And now things are super out of sync. Business requirements have changed in the past year. And, it becomes much more chaotic than the intent was, make it nice and organized. And now it's, out the other direction. So I love that you mentioned that. Now, you said also about the event sourcing, finding out this, how do we then keep track of this source of truth, basically. But I'd like to ask you a question before that. Event sourcing, a lot of times, of course, like anything else in life, requires planning, requires a lot of, thought, and before you go ahead and implement, right? Is event sourcing something that everybody might need? Or is it something that you really have to think about and choose whether it's the right path for you or not?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. If you produce an event model, you'll have your events in your swim lanes neatly organized. The presumption is then that, well, all of this needs to be recorded. Who knows? We would like to replay this truth to get some insights later on. That's not necessarily the case. You have arrived at an understanding, the truth, using an events first approach doesn't mean that everything in the organization that that you try to understand, set out to understand, needs also to be captured.
Mhm.
So there needs to be a decision made, of course, but what is it that is crucially important to us to actually capture, to store, to go back and revisit or use to get some insights that we might not even be aware of currently, but a year from now, that turns out to be important. Now, that is quite a fundamental choice to make, because if you miss out on some swim lane that turns out to be important later on, you didn't start capturing that now, well, you're kind of sort of missing a certain important aspect, of course. So the answer might be just capture everything. And yeah, that's a way to go also. And if you have the infrastructure to support it, capture billions and billions of events, which, for example, Axon does support,
Yeah.
okay. But there might be clear cases where it's obvious that this particular event, swim lane, should be event sourced, another might not be. That's more of that's a fundamental decision to make, but it's also part of the discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really great that you mentioned that, because not everything needs to be sourced and not everything needs to be stored, right? And a very classic example of that, I think, is and it comes down to really how do you design your events, right? That's a whole other topic as well. What do you put in your events that really need to be stored in your event store, for instance, and kept forever? Because we've had a lot of questions and discussions about, all right, so which parts of the information do you really need to store? For instance, if you have a person's information that needs to be captured and stored because that's really crucial for your business and you have to have that, which part of that information do you actually store in your event store? Do you need, for example, their physical, geographical address? Do you need their phone number? Because those can change, right? So do I put something in the event store that possibly and quite frequently might change? Maybe those are the things that you don't need to capture in your event. And that's an interesting one too, because you have to really think about, all right, what do I really need to store? What is actually important for the source of truth that I'm having here? Maybe
Yeah.
if you're storing a person's information, for example, an example in the US, maybe their social security number is something that needs to be stored because that might be really important for what your business trying to do. Now, you probably need to encrypt it and all of that, but it still has to be captured. That is not something that's going to change in a person's lifetime. Phone number, email address, physical address, those are the things that might change. So you may not need to capture all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. Yeah. All right. So moving on with the event sourcing.
Yeah. So you have this. So this event sourcing itself, I think sometimes the hype goes into overdrive in terms of sometimes just it sounds complex. There is so much to learn. Sometimes that's maybe over promises in terms of what it actually does deliver. To me, it's always been a simple concept, a simple pattern. You can, of course, dress it in any way you like to make it more complex, but by itself, it's not hard. It's something, again, you write the truth. Now you're using this truth as it's constantly being updated to make decisions. Just source it to make decisions. Okay.
Simple enough.
That's usually when I try to explain it to my friends or even parents, God forbid, that's usually enough. And if there are the real life examples abound, right? You need prior information of what has happened to make the next state transition or the next determination of what concerns you or someone else or something else. Okay, you source that history and you choose something that will add to that history. In itself, not a tricky concept, I think.
Yeah.
Now, to employ it in a mission critical system to support your business domain that has any number of flows, etc. Of course, it's there's more to it. But I think there is too much dramatization when it comes to event sourcing, and I guess our job is to make it less of a dramatic thing to investigate and maybe finally implement. So that's at least the goal that I have set up for myself.
Yeah. So I know we're kind of approaching the part where we can open it up to the audience and answer questions if there are any questions. But before we do that, um, if you don't mind, Mark, can we share a couple of things about what event modeling looks like when you've done it? And I actually have our demo application event modeling example open, not the application, but just the mirror.
Yep.
We can share that. Let me see. And this mirror board is publicly available if anybody wants to check it out. The only thing is that it's view only, of course. So, but do check it out and see if it's something that can be beneficial for you. Stuff over here, there we go. And too many things open, there we have it. Okay. So, so of course there are various steps that we have to take when event modeling, right? One of these that comes a little bit before that. So this is a pretty long example and good example. So we have two things here in this mirror board. One is talking about a hotel room booking, and another one is a music lesson application. My background is in music, and I created this board, so I just wanted to do something that was a little bit closer to home for me. So here you have these various sticky notes, and they're orange because they are representing events. So as Mark mentioned, this is sort of event first approach, right? You figure out what events you want to capture, and then everybody in your stakeholder team comes together and puts their ideas on orange stickies. Wherever it is, you can pick a wall. We did it with a group of people, and everybody just stuck their notes on a whiteboard or a wall. And that's really cool because you have this like initial chaos of everybody's just coming in, putting everything together, and then you have to stand back and look at the whole thing and say, okay, maybe this one is not needed. Maybe this part we don't need to store. So then it kind of like thins out as you go. So you do the brainstorming part first. And then once you get into, all right, what it is that we actually need part, as you see, your stickies become a lot less. So you will have a few, and this is a very simple example. Of course, with complex systems, you will have a lot more to work with. But essentially, another good thing about event modeling is that you capture the UI experience at the very beginning as well. How is it communicated with the user that's using it? Now, some systems, of course, don't have a UI, so to speak, but you still want to capture that experience that you are expecting to have from your system, right? Whether it's visible or invisible. Maybe your system is communicating with another system and it doesn't necessarily need a UI, but you still have to think about that experience that you're getting from capturing these events. And then the next step after that is, of course, adding your commands, which are in blue, and your queries, the data that you are receiving or sending, what have you, in here as well. And then the communication and the relationship between those commands and queries with your events. So there's a lot involved in event modeling that is really neat and great. There's a lot more detail, and Mark and I can talk about this for days. So, Mark, if you'd like to add anything to it, and of course, a little bit later on, we bring it into how can you use Axon, for instance, test application to be able to really test your theories before you deploy everything.
Yeah. What I like about this is, and so far I've not found a better compromise, call it that, in terms of finding common ground, is we don't care about logic here. That sounds weird. What I mean by logic is business logic. We don't care about that at all. The only thing we care about are outcomes. The happy outcome or the ones that are less happy.
Yeah.
That is surprisingly easy after a little while for most people, if not all, to grasp. How did we end up with a certain event?
Right.
Well, who cares? We know that this can happen.
Yeah.
This has happened with this failure happen instead. If that's the common ground, the foundation for our understanding, it's amazing how efficient and effective you can be. I think Adam speaks about this in one of his great presentations, that no matter what level you're on, what role you have in your organization, just the fact you're talking about outcomes is, well, a neat discovery in terms of just with only this as your focus, you can build out as we see, quite a detailed understanding of your dynamics in your business domain.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
It captures a lot for sure. Gives you a lot of room to work with. All right, fantastic. Really, really great conversation, Marc. And if I may say so myself, but it's a really cool topic, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. And when I first started learning about event modeling several years back, it was kind of like an eye-opener. This is a good place to start things. And it's visual, and I'm a visual learner, so that always helps. I want to open it to our attendees. If you have any questions, comments, maybe you have experience with event modeling or event sourcing or even starting a project, and just how do you go about it? Because I think that's one of the hardest parts about designing software systems or doing anything. Starting a business, just that first step is the hardest, right? So if you'd like to post your questions or comments in the chat, please do so. If you'd like to raise your hand and talk with us directly, I love that, because that gives us a nice way to talk with you and connect with you. Awesome. Hi, Lawrence. Please go ahead and ask your question. If you'd like to have your video as well, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, you're on. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Lawrence. Good to meet you guys.
Great
Thank you for doing this. It's a very welcome source of information for me, looking into event sourcing and actually into the world of designing software systems in Grand, because I'm very new to this topic. But I have done some work on my own and have done a bit. By the way, can I turn on my camera? Or is my camera on?
Of course. Yes, I think you should be able to.
I just don't know how that works. I'm not familiar with.
You should have a button on the bottom left that says video. If you, it should have a crossover. If you click it, it should be able to bring you.
Right. Okay, I can see it.
Drew, can we? Okay, great.
Yeah. So for video, I just promote to panelists, but it's all good. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, great.
All right, great. Hi.
Now I can see you. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome in.
Yeah, and I've come about two things. These are more technical questions, so I'm not sure if this is what you want to discuss in this coffee talk.
Ask away. If it's too technical, we can always set up a time and talk.
Okay, more. It's also a bit on between the technical and strategical realm, I guess. So strategy realm. Two things. First thing first. Sometimes designing events are having difficulties deciding between more technical events and real domain events, while I'm always trying to go for domain events because that's what we're interested in, which is interesting later on when you want your system to make actual decisions or, like react to something that happened in the domain. You want your system to be able to answer to that and not just, like an event like a username changed or something like that. But anyways, when starting to write a service, for example, that is handling information about people, that's something I'm working on currently, you need all these more technical events as well, I guess, because sometimes you just want to do that, change the first name or add a second or add a name when someone has changed their name. That's a good example because a name change is a domain event, while updating a name is maybe just a technical event, right? Mm-hmm. So what's the general concept? Are you, as a more experienced team or developer in event sourcing, would you do both? Would you do all the technical events that are maybe needed later on and wait with the domain events until you actually need them, or what's the strategy to solve this?
So I can give you the short answer and I'll have Marc give you the longer answer. It always depends, right? It depends because and it is a fantastic question, Lawrence. I'm really glad you brought it up because it's a question that almost everybody asks when they first start. It really depends on what you really need to store. And an example I can think of right now is you mentioned if a person's name changes, I want to have that in storage because I have to know whether or not the person's name changed. Well, for instance, if you are a city hall here in a city, and if I go and get married and want to take my husband's name or maybe have a joint name, that requires me to change my name officially. Sign papers, go through a lot of hassle. I've done it, no from experience, it's a lot. But the city hall, right, they need to record that into their system. It is a very important information for them to have in their system. So that becomes their domain event. And that becomes something that you want to have keep track of and keep on tracking of because, you know, sometimes people change their names various times throughout their lives, but it is the same person with the same social security number, the same, you know, medical records and so on. So that becomes a very important thing for them to have in their system. But if, for example, I'm running a bakery, do I need to have somebody's name, like last name changed? Maybe not. But do I need to have their email address? Maybe I really want to have their email address because it's super important for my marketing, right? So it just really depends on your business case. And Marc, I'm gonna have you talk some more about it if.
I think your answer was both long and good, and the longishness was good. I think the technical event is depending on, again, what's your definition of technical, but event modeling doesn't feature technical and what you event source typically doesn't feature anything quote unquote technical. Otherwise, it would serve the implementer's needs more than the domains or the organization's needs, right? So if I look at an event model and I invite a knowledgeable domain person into the room, please look at this, and they see something that maybe comes across as technical. Well,
yeah, what I mean by technical event is like the result of a user action. For example, a user sets up a new person in the system, enters a name, realizes, oh, I misspelled the name, I want to change the name. And that's what I mean by technical. It's a state update that is necessary, but it has no specific business meaning. Like it doesn't have domain meaning. It's just changing the name because I misspelled it.
Yeah, but as Sarah also mentioned, that could be important to somebody or some capability in the business domain or not. You don't know maybe from the beginning. So you need to set out to discover the truth about the change of a person's name, which is going to be interesting in itself. And again, as you say, some swim lanes might not even be event sort. It's not that interesting. We just represent the fact that the name was changed, but it could just be state stored. We don't assign more value to it. But on the other hand, as in Sarah's example, it's hugely important to be able to track these changes. So yeah, whatever you arrive at in terms of the truth about the importance of this particular state change is, we'll leave that up to you. But keep that is, yeah.
And I love this question, and it kind of brings us back. And I'm glad, Marc, you asked the question of what do you mean by technical events? Because this is kind of like what we're talking about when you bring in the stakeholders in the same room and you have a conversation. And this is where the ubiquitous language comes in. What do you mean by technical event versus a business or a domain event, right? Those distinctions are important to identify as well. Now, in your case, for example, the example that you gave, if somebody spelled their name incorrectly, and now they have to go back and change it. Now, there are things you can do before storing events. You can have some checks in place for people to go in. For example, if you're filling out a form for an event, for example, I just signed up my family for a run for the school coming up this month. You have to fill in all the information, your name, address, blah, 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 everything that's needed. Now, before you click the payment submission, it gives you a chance to twice at least to go back and check the information that you have entered before it allows you to submit the form. So you can have some of these checks in place before you store something that is really important for your domain. So that misspelling of a name or, putting a wrong address there can be caught before you actually busy your business, so to speak, with storing these things.
And just to finish up that particular question, Lawrence, is the mistakes themselves can be highly valuable insights.
Yeah.
How often do people actually misspell? Is that common? Why?
Yeah.
To have that recorded and be able to query that later can be very, very beneficial to certain organizations. Maybe they can fix their processes better to eliminate these mistakes or get some insight in their users, etc. So, yeah. Even a simple thing like this is quite multifaceted, as you see. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Of course.
But did you have a second concern you wanted to ask about? Or
Yeah, if you want to continue with me, I will have a second question for you. That would be great.
Sure, unless somebody else has a question. And please raise your hand,
Right.
in the middle as well. We can always hop over and back. But if nobody has a question, and we can continue.
All right. Okay, great. My second question is regards do we need a separation of event stores for internal events, say for a microservice that is carrying for information about people, for example, and external events that, and with external events, I mean like events that we are sending out of our bounded context to other bounded context through maybe a open host service, event mapping, right? Or we would consume in our microservice, we would consume external events in an ACL, for example. So are you going to split the event stores, or does all that happen in the same event store? Because I would imagine that to keep the events in sync, it would be very helpful to have everything in one event store. On the other hand, we would kind of marry the state record in the form of event stores of very different parts of an open system. And I was wondering what a typical strategy is in this case. Thank you.
So this is one of those excellent, you can technically do that, have one event stored at all context access, but should you do it?
Right.
In totally different question. So for example, in Axon server, you can have multiple contexts, each dedicated to their own bounded context. Doesn't mean that every context should consume the internal events of other contexts. You can do it, but it's a better question to ask yourself, should you do it? Should you respect the boundaries that you ended up modeling? And should you protect those boundaries? As you mentioned, external events. There are such things for a reason. And my preference would be, yes, you should be able to treat your internals as internal details, not expose that. There are analogs that we go to in other scenarios for this when we build systems. The same sort of logic applies here. Sometimes we make shortcuts for maybe optimization reasons, but in general, I would recommend to store your internals where they belong. And if you need to communicate something using that you also have context mapped, for example, be mindful of this. Share consciously between your different parts of your business domain, so they can continue to be loosely coupled, operate independently, and so forth. Again, the technical means are there if you want to start to get those internal events, consume them for whatever reason. But again, I would caution you to do that before you embark on that. Am I not better off just respecting my boundaries and set up communication channels that do make sense if I want to have integrations of this kind?
Right. Okay.
And I want to highlight something that Marc mentioned, which is in Axon server, which is obviously what we use. You do have the option of storing your events from multiple contexts within your Axon server clusters. So if you're thinking location-wise, right, where do I store everything? Can I store everything under the same database, if you would? In Axon server's case, yes, absolutely, you can. Now, should I mix everything together? Absolutely not. Keep your contexts separate. Make sure you have identified where does this set, where does this event or these sets of events belong? Which context do they belong in? Keep them within that context, within the boundaries of those contexts. And the whole topic of bounded context is a whole other topic, which we'll get to at some point, hopefully in the future. But be mindful of those contexts. Now, as you mentioned, some of the contexts do need to overlap a little bit, or maybe talk to each other. That's where you coming into orchestration of how do these events talk to each other? Do you have downstream systems, upstream, whatever? Do you want to save things from external third-party services that you're using? Maybe, maybe not. So those are the things that you have to really identify and put into their, I hate to use this term, but for the lack of a better term, into their own box, so to speak. But then you can stack all those boxes together in the closet, in that same closet. They're still separate from each other, but they're still in the same space that you can store them together. So in the case of Axon Server, absolutely you can do that. Other databases, you may not be able to do that because they're not meant for event sourcing and for storing events specifically.
Sure, yeah. I was aiming at using Axon Server, of course, and so I understand that you would recommend using contexts in the server for special services or whatever they're using, and you would have one general context through which different contexts can communicate through context maps.
Sometimes not. Yeah. You may not need that general context. You may not need a parent context. Matter of fact, most people don't. You have your individual contexts that are just there serving their purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Great
Very
question.
good questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to jump in. If not, if you'd like to learn more about these topics, Drew has shared some of the links here. And Drew, if you don't mind, would you share the events as well here in the text? And I'll see if it can.
Yes, I'll share those, Sarah, and then also the links.
Go in the emails, right?
Yeah, the links in the follow-up email with all the resources will be in there as well.
Awesome. And as we close off the session, there will be a feedback form, which I would love for you all to fill it out and let us know what you thought of this session. Like I said, this is the first in the series that we're doing this year. So let us know your thoughts, your opinions on the topic or the format or whatever it is that you'd like to share with us. The more, the better. That way we can improve as we go and we can, serve your needs better. And the next one, I believe we have planned for April, I think, coming up next month. Either end of April or beginning of May. I have to check with the other involved parties to make sure we have the dates. But keep an eye on our events page. We will also post these on our LinkedIn and other social media areas. And yeah, we'd love to see you and your friends next time. And yeah, have a conversation with us and talk with us. Let us know what you think. Otherwise, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Marc, for joining me today. And thank you all for spending part of your day with us and joining us in this coffee chat. Have a great rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.